Firebase Coral, Bien Hoa Province, South Vietnam. May 12, 1968, 02:30 hours. Captain Mike Wells of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division's 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry, pressed himself deeper into his foxhole as mortar rounds walked across the perimeter. 3 feet of hard-packed red earth separated him from oblivion. He'd spent 90 minutes that evening digging this hole. Standard procedure, beaten into every American infantryman since basic training. Dig in. Get below ground level. Make yourself small. The textbook said a properly constructed foxhole could withstand anything short of a direct hit. 50 meters away, Sergeant Barry Peterson of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam reclined in his hammock, suspended 18 inches above the jungle floor between 2 rubber trees. No hole, no sandbags. Just green canvas and mosquito netting swaying gently in the humid night air. Wells had warned the Australians about this exact scenario 3 days earlier. "You boys are gonna get yourselves killed sleeping up there like Christmas presents. Charlie loves an easy target." Peterson had smiled. "Mate, we've been doing this for 6 years. Trust me, you're the ones in the wrong spot." Now, as the barrage intensified, Wells watched in disbelief as Peterson calmly rolled from his hammock, weapon in hand, and moved to a firing position behind a tree. No frantic scrambling from a hole, no disorientation, just smooth, practiced movement in pitch darkness. When the NVA ground assault hit 30 seconds later, Wells would discover that everything the U.S. Army had taught him about jungle warfare was backwards. The Australians weren't reckless. They weren't lucky. They'd simply figured out what Americans refused to believe. In the Vietnamese jungle, the safest place to sleep wasn't below ground. It was above it. The American military arrived in Vietnam with doctrine forged in the foxholes of Europe and Korea. Dig in. Create firing positions. Establish defensive perimeters below ground level. Every infantry manual, every training exercise, every combat veteran's advice pointed to the same conclusion. When you stop moving, you dig. The foxhole is the infantryman's best friend. Proclaimed the 1965 edition of FM 2175, Combat Training of the Individual Soldier and Patrolling. A properly constructed fighting position provides protection from small arms, fire, shrapnel, and allows for effective engagement of the enemy while minimizing exposure. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, who would lead the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry at Ia Drang in November 1965, watched Australian advisors set up hammocks during a joint training exercise and shook his head. "I admired their courage," he later recalled, "but I couldn't understand their tactics. We'd just fought in Korea where not digging in could get an entire platoon killed. The idea of sleeping exposed seemed like suicide." This wasn't arrogance. It was experience. American doctrine had evolved through brutal lessons learned at places like Frozen Chosen and Porkchop Hill, where proper entrenchment meant the difference between survival and annihilation. General William Westmoreland, commanding MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, built his strategy around this proven approach. "We will establish fire support bases throughout the tactical area," he announced in 1965. "From these fortified positions, we will conduct search and destroy operations, returning each night to prepared defensive positions." The Australian approach seemed to violate every principle of modern warfare. When the 1st Australian SAS Squadron arrived in 1966, American advisors were stunned. Captain James McComas, assigned as liaison to the Australians at Nui Dat, wrote in his after-action report, "The AATTV, Australian Army Training Team Vietnam personnel, refuse to dig defensive positions. Instead, they sleep in hammocks suspended above ground, claiming this provides better security." This practice appears to contradict all established doctrine regarding base security and force protection. The skepticism extended beyond sleeping arrangements. The entire Australian philosophy seemed alien to American sensibilities. While U.S. units moved in company or battalion strength, cleared massive landing zones, and established elaborate firebase networks, the Australians operated in six-man patrols, lived in the jungle for weeks at a time, and avoided fixed positions whenever possible. "They're going to learn the hard way," predicted one U.S. Marine Corps captain after observing Australian tactics near Da Nang in 1966. "The NVA aren't some Bush League guerrillas. These guys have artillery, mortars, and sophisticated tactics. The first time they hit an Australian position at night, those hammocks are going to turn into death traps." The logic seemed unassailable. An enemy mortar crew could drop rounds directly into a hammock's position with devastating effect. A soldier scrambling out of a hammock would be disoriented, slower to reach his weapon, silhouetted against the sky. And the psychological factor seemed equally damning. How could anyone sleep soundly knowing they were exposed, vulnerable, hanging in the open? American sergeants teaching jungle warfare at Fort Benning pointed to the Australian method as exactly what not to do. "You dig a foxhole for 3 reasons," they'd tell recruits. "Protection, protection, and protection. Don't let anyone tell you different." By late 1966, as American combat strength in Vietnam swelled past 35,000 troops, the doctrinal divide had become standard joke material. How do you spot an Australian patrol base? Look for the hammocks. How do you know they won't last long? Same reason. The Australians, for their part, watched Americans dig holes every single night with something approaching pity mixed with frustration. "They're exhausting themselves before the fighting even starts," observed Warrant Officer Jack Kelly of the AAT-TV. "And they're sleeping in the most dangerous spot in the entire jungle." But the Americans had the numbers, the firepower, and the institutional weight of the world's most powerful military behind them. Surely their doctrine, refined through decades of global warfare, would prove superior to the unconventional methods of a small Allied force. The Vietnamese jungle, however, was about to deliver a verdict that would challenge everything the American military thought it knew about infantry warfare. The Australian approach to jungle warfare didn't emerge from theory. It was forged in the mountains and rainforests of Papua New Guinea during World War II, then refined through 12 years of counterinsurgency operations in Malaya. Between 1942 and 1945, Australian forces fought Japanese troops through some of the world's most hostile terrain along the Kokoda Track and throughout New Guinea. Captain Stan Bisse, who would later train troops for Vietnam, survived the Kokoda campaign and learned brutal lessons about jungle combat. "The Japanese taught us that conventional tactics got you killed," he recalled. "They'd watch you dig in at night, then mortar your positions at first light. We lost entire platoons because we were exactly where the enemy expected us to be, in holes we'd advertised by clearing the ground and digging." The Australians began experimenting with alternative methods. Instead of digging fighting positions, they learned to use natural terrain features. Instead of clearing fields of fire, they embraced concealment. And instead of sleeping in the ground, they began sleeping above it in hammocks, originally designed as lightweight shelter, but quickly recognized as a tactical advantage. The hammock solution solved multiple problems simultaneously. In the tropical environment, ground-level positions filled with water, breeding mosquitoes and leeches. Soldiers sleeping on the ground woke up soaked, exhausted, and often ill. The humid air hung heavy at ground level, but 18 inches up, there was airflow. More importantly, the elevation kept soldiers away from ground-dwelling threats: snakes, scorpions, centipedes, and the red jungle ants whose bite could make a strong man scream. But the real tactical advantage wasn't discovered until Malaya. From 1950 to 1960, Australian forces fought alongside British troops against communist insurgents in the Malayan Emergency. This wasn't conventional warfare. It was counterinsurgency in dense jungle against an enemy who lived in the forest. The communist terrorists, as they were officially designated, could disappear into terrain where even the sound of digging would carry for hundreds of meters in the still night air. Sergeant Bob Buick of the 1st Special Air Service Company discovered the critical insight during a patrol in 1955 near Ipoh. We'd been tracking a CT group for 3 days, finally located their camp just after dark. There were 6 of them, all in hammocks about 2 feet off the ground. We had them cold, except we couldn't see them. We literally walked within 3 meters of their position without knowing it. The hammocks were invisible in the dark, strung between trees that blended into the shadows. If they'd dug holes, we'd have spotted the disturbed earth immediately. The Australians realized something Americans would take years to understand. In jungle warfare, your greatest vulnerability wasn't being exposed. It was being where the enemy expected you to be. A foxhole was a beacon, a guaranteed position that announced, "Target here." A hammock was invisible, mobile, and could be positioned anywhere in the 3-dimensional jungle environment. By the time Australian advisors arrived in Vietnam in 1962, hammock warfare was institutional knowledge, taught to every soldier heading to Southeast Asia. The Australian Army Jungle Training Centre at Canungra, Queensland, built its entire doctrine around mobility, concealment, and endurance. The jungle is your home, not your enemy, instructors told trainees. Live in it naturally. Don't fight it by digging holes and clearing ground. Move through it like the locals do. The hammock became central to this philosophy. Each Australian soldier deployed to Vietnam carried a lightweight nylon hammock, mosquito net, and waterproof poncho that could be configured into a complete shelter system weighing under 3 pounds. Setup time, 90 seconds. Takedown time, 60 seconds. No digging required. The Americans, meanwhile, arrived with different experience. Korean War veterans had learned that nighttime attacks could be devastating without proper entrenchment. At places like Chosin Reservoir and Heartbreak Ridge, units that failed to dig in suffered catastrophic casualties. The lesson was clear. At night, get underground. These conflicting doctrines collided in 1965 when the first large U.S. combat units deployed alongside existing Australian advisory teams. At Bien Hoa Air Base, American and Australian units often established adjacent positions. The contrast was stark. Americans would spend 2 hours before sunset digging foxholes, filling sandbags, and creating elaborate defensive networks. Australians would arrive, string hammocks between trees, and be settled in 15 minutes. Major Peter Badco of the AAT-TV attempted to explain the Australian method to his American counterparts. "We're not trying to be different for the sake of it," he told a group of U.S. advisors in August 1965. "This is based on experience. When you dig, you create a signature. The sound carries. The fresh earth is visible. You leave traces that any experienced tracker can spot. And when the enemy finds those holes, they know exactly where to aim their mortars." The Americans remained unconvinced. Their doctrine worked. It had worked in Europe, in Korea, in training exercises across the world. Why abandon proven methods for what seemed like reckless experimentation? Then came the night attacks. Fire Support Base Coral, May 12-13, 1968. Zoto 243 hours. The NVA 165th Regiment had been watching Firebase Coral for 3 days through the jungle canopy. They'd counted the positions, mapped the defensive layout, and planned their assault with precision. Intelligence reports indicated approximately 800 Americans occupying the firebase. The Vietnamese commander, Colonel Nguyen Thanh Son, had 2,400 troops at his disposal. The American positions were textbook perfect. The 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry, had dug in exactly according to FM 7-10 doctrine. 3-foot-deep foxholes arranged in a defensive perimeter, cleared fields of fire, interlocking positions. Every soldier knew exactly where to go when the attack came. That's exactly what killed them. At 0243, the mortar barrage began. 82mm rounds walked across the firebase with methodical precision, each one targeting a specific defensive position. The NVA forward observers had spent days marking every fighting hole, every bunker, every likely position on their maps. Now, they were cashing in that intelligence. Captain Mike Wells huddled in his foxhole as a round impacted 6 meters away. Shrapnel hummed overhead. He keyed his radio. "All stations, this is Sabre 6. Enemy mortars inbound. Stay in your holes. Stay down." 50 meters away, the 8 Australian advisors attached to the firebase were already moving. Sergeant Barry Peterson rolled from his hammock, grabbed his weapon, and took position behind a large rubber tree, 4 meters from where he'd been sleeping. Warrant Officer Jim Chapman moved to a different tree. Corporal Kevin Burns shifted to a fallen log. In 15 seconds, the Australians had gone from sleeping positions to fighting positions that bore no relationship to where they'd been 30 seconds earlier. The NVA had no idea where they were. The mortars lifted at 0247. The ground assault came immediately after. The classic pattern. NVA infantry emerged from the tree line in coordinated waves, weapons firing, heading directly for the American defensive positions they'd mapped. But they ran straight into the Australians' fields of fire from completely unexpected angles. "Contact!" Peterson's voice crackled over the radio. His SLR, self-loading rifle, barked in precise, measured shots. Not the wild automatic fire of panicked troops, but the disciplined shooting of someone in complete control. Each round found a target. The Americans, scrambling out of foxholes that had become death traps, were silhouetted against the firebase lights and fires. NVA troops knew exactly where to aim. The holes were visual reference points, fighting positions that couldn't move. Every foxhole was a fixed coordinate on an enemy map. The Australians were ghosts. Their firing positions bore no relationship to their sleeping positions. They moved constantly, using the three-dimensional jungle environment. While Americans fought from static holes, Australians fired from behind trees, shifted to new positions, flanked NVA troops who thought they knew where the defenders were. The battle lasted 4 hours. When dawn broke, 34 American soldiers were dead and 109 wounded. The NVA had suffered approximately 250 casualties, but they'd achieved their tactical objective of disrupting the firebase. The 8 Australians had 0 casualties, not wounded, not scratched. Captain Wells stood at the perimeter at first light, staring at Peterson's hammock. It hung undisturbed, untouched. The foxhole 3 meters away, the one he'd insisted the Australians should dig, had taken a direct mortar hit. It was a smoking crater. "Jesus Christ," Wells whispered. "You were right." On Long Tan, Phuoc Tuy Province, August 18th, 1966. The Battle of Long Tan would become Australia's most famous engagement of the Vietnam War, but it also provided the most dramatic proof of their tactical philosophy. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, faced between 2,500 and 2,500 NVA and Viet Cong troops in a rubber plantation during a monsoon. The Australians had been on patrol, not in a prepared position. When they were ambushed, they didn't have the option to dig in. The ground was too hard, the enemy too close. Instead, they used the rubber trees themselves as cover, constantly moving, never staying in one position long enough for the enemy to fix their location. Company Sergeant Major Jack Kirby, who fought at Long Tan, described the contrast. "We'd trained for this exact scenario. Don't be where the enemy expects. Use natural cover. Stay mobile. The VC tried every trick. They'd concentrate fire on one tree, but by the time they'd saturated that position, we'd already moved. They couldn't hit what they couldn't pin down. The Americans monitoring the battle from Nui Dot Base were stunned. Radio intercepts revealed VC commanders growing increasingly frustrated. They were firing at positions that were already empty. The Australians, unburdened by the need to defend fixed positions, could choose when and where to engage. By the time reinforcements arrived and the battle ended, D Company had inflicted an estimated 245 enemy killed for the loss of 18 Australians. It was the mobility and unpredictability that saved them, the same principles that made their hammock doctrine effective. Nui Dot Bus, September 1966. After Long Ton, American officers began paying closer attention to Australian methods. Colonel John J. Tolson III, commanding the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, visited the Australian Task Force base at Nui Dot specifically to observe their defensive positions. What he found shocked him. "I expected to see elaborate fortifications," he wrote in his after-action report. "Instead, I saw something that looked almost casual. Hammocks strung between trees, minimal ground disturbance, nearly invisible fighting positions that could be abandoned in seconds. And their casualty rates were consistently lower than comparable U.S. units." Tolson arranged for a joint exercise. One company of U.S. troops and one Australian company would establish defensive positions in adjacent sectors. Both would be attacked by a third unit using blank ammunition and umpires. The results were devastating for American doctrine. The attacking force located and destroyed the American positions in 40 minutes. They couldn't find the Australian positions at all. Even knowing approximately where the Australians were, the attackers walked past hammock positions repeatedly without seeing them. "The hammocks were invisible," reported the umpire, Major Bruce P. Crandall. "Even in daylight, with people actively looking for them, they blended into the forest. The Foxholes, on the other hand, might as well have had neon signs. The soil disruption, the cleared firing positions, everything advertised exactly where defenders were located." Mabindin Province, February 1967. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration came during Operation Pershing, when Australian SS Sergeant Ron Swanton's 6-man patrol was ambushed by an estimated 40 NVA troops near Nkay. The Australians had been sleeping in hammocks when the attack began at 03:30. Instead of being trapped, they were already mobile. Each man had memorized his rally point and fallback position before going to sleep. The hammocks were irrelevant. What mattered was the tactical flexibility they enabled. "We didn't fight from where we slept," Swanton explained later. "That would be suicidal. But because we hadn't dug in, hadn't committed to fixed positions, we had options. We could move to better firing positions immediately. The NVA were shooting at where they thought we were, where they would have been if they'd dug holes. We were somewhere else entirely." The patrol inflicted 12 confirmed kills and broke contact with 0 casualties. The after-action report noted, "Enemy appeared confused by inability to fix patrol positions. Concentrated fire on likely defensive positions which were unoccupied." By mid-1967, some American units began experimenting with Australian techniques. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, operating in the Central Highlands, started using hammocks on extended patrols. Captain Harold Eatman reported, "The men were skeptical at first, but after the first week, they wouldn't go back to sleeping on the ground. Better rest, fewer health issues, and they felt less exposed, not because the hammocks protected them, but because they weren't tied to a fixed position." The gradual adoption of Australian techniques by American forces wasn't a smooth institutional change. It was a grassroots revolution driven by soldiers who'd learned the hard way that doctrine and reality were sometimes incompatible. American evolution. By 1968, Lieutenant General William B. Rawson, commanding of Field Force Vietnam, had authorized tactical flexibility in selection of overnight positions for reconnaissance and patrol elements. This bureaucratic language translated to, units could use hammocks if they wanted to. The change started with Special Forces. The 5th Special Forces Group, working in remote areas with small teams, adopted hammock warfare wholesale by late 1916. Captain Larry Dring, commanding A502 in the Central Highlands, made hammocks mandatory for his Mike forces. "We were living in Indian country for weeks at a time," he explained. "You can't dig a new hole every night when you're moving through NVA territory." And after watching the Australians operate, it became obvious. The hammock wasn't a luxury, it was a tactical necessity. The elite long-range reconnaissance patrols, LRRPs, followed suit. These small teams, operating deep behind enemy lines, needed every advantage. Staff Sergeant Ronald Schurer, running missions in the 3rd Corps, found that hammocks solved multiple problems. Noise discipline was critical for us. You try digging a hole silently in jungle soil, can't be done. But hammocks? 60 seconds and you're set up without making a sound. And when you need to move fast, you're not climbing out of a hole. Ranger companies, particularly those operating in the Mekong Delta where the water table was inches below the surface, had no choice but to sleep above ground. But even after moving to drier terrain, many kept the hammocks. First Lieutenant James Gazer of Company F, 75th Infantry wrote, "We did a side-by-side comparison. First week, we dug in every night. Standard operating procedure. Average setup time was 90 minutes. The men were exhausted before dark, and we lost 2 guys to heat exhaustion from the extra work. Second week, we used hammocks. Setup time was under 10 minutes. The men were rested, alert, and we could move our position twice during the night without any noise or effort. But the vast majority of American forces continued digging. The conventional wisdom was too strong, the institutional inertia too great. Foxholes were proven, hammocks were experimental. And for soldiers rotating through 12-month tours, the temptation to stick with familiar methods was overwhelming. The compromise many units reached was selective adoption, hammocks on patrols, foxholes at firebases. This made practical sense, but missed the deeper tactical lesson that being unpredictable was itself a defense. Vietnamese counter-tactics. The NVA-NVC, meanwhile, had been studying American patterns since 1965. Their tactical manuals from 1968, captured during operations, revealed sophisticated understanding of U.S. defensive doctrine. A People's Liberation Armed Forces training document recovered near Hue listed American defensive weaknesses that included predictable layouts, heavy reliance on permanent positions, clearing of fields of fire that reveal location. The NVA specifically targeted the American habit of digging in. Senior Colonel Hoang Minh Thao, commanding forces in the Central Highlands, issued orders in 1967. When locating American units, look for fresh earth, cleared areas, and regular patterns. These indicate fighting positions. Mortar crews should pre-register these positions and fire immediately upon contact. This was the deadly feedback loop American units found themselves in. The more elaborate the defensive position, the more visible it became. The more visible it became, the more vulnerable. Against Australian units, the Vietnamese faced a different problem. A captured NVA after-action report from 1968, translated by U.S. intelligence, noted with frustration, Australian positions cannot be located until combat is initiated. They do not clear fields of fire. They do not dig fighting positions. They appear to sleep in temporary shelters, but do not defend from these locations. When engaged, they are always in unexpected positions. The Vietnamese adapted by trying to locate Australian units through different means, tracking, surveillance, human intelligence, but found them far harder to target with indirect fire. A Viet Cong tactical assessment captured in 1969 recommended, against Australian units, close assault is more effective than preparatory fires. Their positions cannot be determined accurately until ground contact is made. This was both an admission of Australian effectiveness and a dangerous development. It meant the Vietnamese were adapting to bring the fight to close quarters, where superior numbers might tell. The psychological dimension. The mental aspect of sleeping above ground versus below ground proved surprisingly significant. American soldiers in foxholes reported feeling like turtles hiding in shells, safe from indirect fire but trapped, immobile, and vulnerable during actual assaults. The psychological comfort of the whole often translated to tactical rigidity. Specialist 4 Dennis Fuji, 25th Infantry Division, kept a diary that captured this evolution. First night in a hammock, I barely slept, felt exposed, vulnerable. By the third night, I realized something. In a foxhole, I was always worried about mortars or RPGs landing in my hole. In a hammock, I knew that if something went wrong, I could move instantly. That made me sleep better, not worse. I wasn't trapped. The Australians had understood this from the beginning. Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley, who would be killed in action in November 1965 and posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, explained it to American colleagues during training. A foxhole gives you the illusion of safety, but it's a trap. In a hammock, you know you're vulnerable, so you stay alert. And when things go bad, you're already mobile. The hole isn't protecting you, it's anchoring you. This psychological insight, that perceived vulnerability could actually increase survival, was counterintuitive enough that many American commanders never accepted it. Even units that adopted hammocks on patrol often reverted to foxholes at firebases, unwilling to fully commit to the new doctrine. The statistics tell the story. By 1970, enough data existed to draw meaningful conclusions. Australian units operating in Phuoc Tuy province suffered casualty rates 40 to 60% lower than comparable American units in similar terrain. The Australian Task Force, operating from 1966 to 1971 with an average strength of 8,000 troops, suffered 521 total battle deaths over 5 years. The American 1st Infantry Division, roughly comparable in size and mission, suffered 1,124 battle deaths in 1967 alone. Multiple factors contributed to these differences: training, tactics, operational tempo, but the consistency was striking. Australian units consistently suffered fewer casualties during nighttime attacks and ambushes, precisely the scenarios where defensive positions mattered most. A Rand Corporation study from 1971, Comparative Analysis of Allied Force Effectiveness in the 3 and a Fjord Corps, noted, Australian forces demonstrate significantly lower casualty rates during defensive operations, particularly night attacks on patrol bases and temporary positions. This advantage appears directly correlated with their tactical flexibility and refusal to occupy predictable defensive positions. The period from 1967 to 1970 represented the height of Australian tactical influence in Vietnam. Their methods had been proven not just effective, but superior in the specific conditions of Vietnamese jungle warfare. Yet, full American adoption never occurred, revealing the limits of tactical innovation within institutional structures. The numbers at scale. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian forces conducted over 200,000 patrol days in Phuoc Tuy province. Their casualty figures reveal the stark effectiveness of their approach. 521 killed in action over 5 years against estimated enemy casualties of 6,500 to 8,000. a kill ratio exceeding 12.1. Compare this to American forces operating in similar terrain. The U.S. 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, facing comparable enemies from 1967-1969, suffered 1,653 killed in action, while inflicting estimated casualties of 16,000 tolerant, roughly 10.1, but with significantly higher friendly losses. The Australian 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, provides the most dramatic example. During their 1971 deployment, they suffered 0 battlefield deaths while conducting continuous operations and inflicting over 100 confirmed enemy casualties. Their after-action reports consistently noted, "Enemy unable to effectively target patrol bases due to absence of fixed defensive positions." The Firebase question. The American reliance on firebases created a fundamental vulnerability that the Australian approach couldn't fully solve. Because firebases were, by definition, fixed positions that couldn't be concealed. Fire Support Base Marianne, overrun in March 1971 with 30 Americans killed, represented everything wrong with static defensive doctrine. The NVA had surveilled the base, mapped every position, and attacked with precision. Australian commanders studying the Marianne disaster noted that their own fire support bases at Coral and Balmoral, attacked under similar circumstances in 1968, had suffered far fewer casualties. The difference wasn't the firebase itself. It was what happened after the initial barrage. Australian troops, trained to immediately abandon compromised positions and counterattack from unexpected angles, turned the NVA's plan against them. American troops, trained to defend their holes, became anchored to known positions. Lieutenant Colonel Ron Gray, commanding the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment during the Coral-Balmoral operations, explained, "We took casualties from the initial mortars. You can't avoid that when you're in a firebase. But once the ground attack started, our men weren't where the enemy expected. They'd done their reconnaissance, but they'd mapped positions that no longer mattered. We fought from wherever gave us the advantage." The medical evidence, beyond the tactical effectiveness, medical data revealed another advantage. Australian forces suffered 60% fewer cases of tropical diseases, 40% fewer heat casualties, and significantly lower rates of psychological stress compared to American units. Army Medical Corps Captain James McCarty, who treated both American and Australian casualties at the 36th Evacuation Hospital in Vung Tau, observed, "The Australians came in healthier, generally. They were sleeping better, dealing with the environmental stress more effectively. The Americans were often exhausted before they ever saw combat, digging holes in 100-degree heat, sleeping in waterlogged positions, fighting the terrain as much as the enemy." The hammock contributed directly to this health differential. Soldiers sleeping above ground avoided ground-level water, insects, and disease vectors. They got better sleep, recovered faster from exertion, and maintained higher operational readiness. The failure of institutional change. Despite overwhelming evidence, the U.S. Army never officially adopted hammock warfare. Individual units used them. Special Operations Forces made them standard. But the institutional military never changed Field Manual 2175 or modified basic training to incorporate Australian methods. The reasons were complex but revealing. Military institutions are conservative by necessity. They standardize tactics that work and resist changes that might introduce risk. The Australian approach worked, but it required trust in small unit leaders, acceptance of temporary vulnerability, and comfort with tactical ambiguity. These weren't American military strengths in the late 1960s. General Crichton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland as MAC commander in 1968, privately admired Australian tactics, but concluded they couldn't be scaled to American force levels. The Australians field small, highly professional forces, he told his staff. "We're fighting with draftees on 12-month rotations. Their tactics require judgment, experience, and trust. We need standardization. This admission revealed the deeper truth. The Australian approach wasn't just about hammocks or holes. It was about a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare that empowered small units, accepted risk, and prioritized tactical flexibility over institutional control. The U.S. military structure, built for conventional warfare and mass mobilization, struggled to adapt these principles. The final irony. By 1971, as American forces drew down, the remaining combat units had quietly adopted many Australian practices. Ranger companies, special forces teams, and long-range patrols universally used hammocks. But the official doctrine never changed. When the last Australian combat forces left Vietnam in 1971, they'd lost 521 men. Tragic, but remarkably low given their operational tempo and the enemy they faced. The Americans, at the same period, had lost over 58,000. Tactical doctrine wasn't the only factor in those casualty rates. Strategy, politics, operational scope, and mission all played roles. But the night-to-night, patrol-to-patrol effectiveness demonstrated by Australian hammock warfare represented a missed opportunity for American forces to reduce casualties through tactical adaptation. Captain Mike Wells returned to Fort Benning in 1969 to teach jungle warfare. He brought hammocks. "I spent the first 6 months of my tour digging holes every night," he told his students. "I spent the second 6 months sleeping in a hammock. I only got shot at during the first 6 months. That's not coincidence." The lessons of Australian hammock warfare eventually permeated American special operations doctrine. Today's U.S. Army Rangers, Special Forces, and Marine Force recon units all train with hammocks as standard equipment for jungle operations. The techniques refined in Vietnam's jungles influence current operations in the Philippines, Colombia, and everywhere else Americans operate in dense terrain. But the deeper lesson, that being unpredictable is itself a defense, that mobility matters more than protection, that soldiers perform better when they trust their training over institutional doctrine, took decades to fully absorb. The Australian approach vindicated a principle that applies far beyond sleeping arrangements. In asymmetric warfare, the smaller force must be more adaptable, more unpredictable, and more willing to abandon conventions that advertise vulnerability. The Americans learned this lesson eventually, though the tuition was paid in casualties that might have been avoided. Sergeant Barry Peterson, who'd survived Firebase Coral and multiple other night attacks, retired from the Australian Army in 1975. When asked about the hammock debate, he shrugged. "We weren't trying to prove a point. We were trying not to die. The hammock wasn't the secret. It was just the visible symbol of thinking differently." The Americans were brave, tough, and incredibly well-equipped, but they were also predictable. And in the jungle, predictable gets you killed. The Vietnamese perspective, rarely heard, validates this assessment. Colonel Bui Tin, NVA officer and journalist, wrote in his memoir, "We feared the Australians more than the Americans, not because they had better weapons, they didn't, but because we could never anticipate where they would be. The Americans fought from places we could find. The Australians fought from places we couldn't predict." That simple distinction, predictable versus unpredictable, explains why thousands of Americans dug foxholes while a few thousand Australians slept in hammocks above the ground. And why, when the battles were over and the casualties counted, one approach had proven itself superior in the brutal laboratory of jungle warfare. The legacy persists in unexpected ways. Modern military procurement includes tactical hammock systems. Training doctrine emphasizes flexibility over rigid defensive positions. And in the jungles of Southeast Asia, if you find old fighting positions, you can still tell who dug them. Americans made holes. Australians left only the faintest marks on trees where hammocks once hung. One approach left scars in the earth that marked exactly where soldiers had been. The other left almost no trace at all. That difference, more than any tactical manual could explain, reveals which philosophy understood the jungle war.